This is the part, Ian, where you get to blame Len. So,
Yes.
Okay, I can take it.
at Masters Men yesterday, he said, we talk a lot about, and especially this class has talked quite a bit about the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 and signs of end times. So Lynn said, do you think we could spend a little time on what's going on in Israel in tomorrow's class? So today we're going to do a detour from, we may get back into it because I haven't spent a lot, I've spent some time on this, just enough to give us kind of a grounding for it. And we may get back to finishing up the session that we started on sexuality and gender in today's culture. But for now, we're going to spend just a little time today on something called Is This the End? By the way, Lynn isn't the only one that I've had ask me this question. I've had my own daughters ask me. I've had a number of people ask me, and I'm sure you've heard conversations about the same thing. So what I've done is I have had some notes that I had in previous Masters Men classes. We've actually done a little bit on this on 2 different occasions in Masters Men. So this is kind of an amalgam of what those are, just to kind of lay out where things are. And so it's expected, I think, especially anything that happens in the Middle East. As soon as something happens in the Middle East, people are immediately saying, is this the end? And the answer is yes, that we are in end times. We've been in end times since the crucifixion. So that's the first thing to understand is that, and over the years in the studying of eschatology I've done, it's become readily apparent to me that to prognosticate when the end will come is a fool's errand. Many thought that Israel's 6-day war in 1967 was the end. Before that, they thought Israel's war in 1948 was the end. Before that, they probably thought each of the wars, in fact, they were called world wars because they were thought to be the wars to end all wars. So this isn't an uncommon topic. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. In fact, we probably should, which we're going to do today. But we probably need to note that we have been in end times since the crucifixion. In fact, probably the first known time that people thought we were in end times was in 66 AD. From 66 to 70 AD, Simon Bargilla, led a revolution in Israel that people all said this is going to be the end times. And ultimately, that will culminate in Masada in 73 AD. That was probably the first time. If you did a web search today, you'd find 6.5 million entries on are we in end times. There's even and it's somewhat called an incomplete list, and I didn't note where I got the reference to this. But there's been at least 153 times since the first century that people said this is end times. The most recent, you probably all remember a guy by the name of Harold Camping. Do you remember Harold Camping? Harold Camping was the guy who in 2011 said end times are near, and he had a pretty good following. And he said the world is going to end on May 11th, 2011.
How did he justify it?
He had a number of ways that he went about it, and I could make a pretty good case. I could prognosticate when I think the exact date would be just from biblical references, but none of them are going to compare to Jesus saying, no one knows.
Exactly.
So, but Harold Camping, first of all, he did it May 11th, 2011. May 12th came, and everybody was still here. So he said, oh, wait a minute. I need to recalculate this piece. It'll be October 21st, 2011. What's today? 2023. By the way, Harold Camping died in 2013. This will not surprise you. He was from Boulder. So is it the end times? Well, Jesus himself says only the Father knows, right? In Matthew 24. What Jesus does do in Matthew 24, which we've talked about before and which Len referred to in the Olivet Discourse, is what he does do is caution us to keep watch. What I've put before you is, I took my notes and made more of a narrative out of it, so it's something you can take with you. And it's going to have pretty much the same, well, it will have exactly the same things I'm going to talk about, but I'm just going to hit the highlights here. In Matthew 24, 42 to 44, here's what Jesus says. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. While we don't know exactly when it's going to occur, we do know that there are signs pointing toward end times. Most of those come from Jesus' the final of 5 discourses, and we've talked about this somewhat in this class too, in Matthew. Matthew's gospel it contains 5 discourses, all by Jesus. And they're rather lengthy, which is the reason they're called discourses. The first one is the Sermon on the Mount that begins in chapter 5 of Matthew. This is the last of his 5 discourses, and it's called the Olivet Discourse because it's from he gives it from the Mount of Olives as he's looking down on the temple and down on Jerusalem. And the apostles say, when will end times be? You remember, Jesus has walked by the temple and he said, not one stone here will be left unturned. So the disciples say, well, when is all this going to be? So Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, discusses that. It's also found in Mark 13 and Luke 21, but nowhere near to the same degree that you'll find it in the Olivet Discourse. So to kind of put the Olivet Discourse and today's events side by side, I thought we'd look at least 3 different signs here. And here's the first sign, which, by the way, isn't going to be out of the Olivet Discourse. So before moving to the Olivet Discourse, we need to look at what many believe is the single event that one can feel reverberations from in today's conflict, and that's the reemergence of Israel. Over 2,600 years ago, the prophet Ezekiel foretold these events, and this is out of Ezekiel chapter 37. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, we have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Now give them this message from the sovereign Lord, O my people. I will open your graves of exile and cause you to rise again. And here's what I want you to listen to. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. Well, now, some people believe that Ezekiel is talking about just coming back out of exile, which happens in 538 or so. Most, however, would point to this fact. He says, I will open your graves of exile. He can't be talking about just then, because what's going to happen in 70 AD? The destruction of the temple. So a lot of people will point to this verse as kind of the last major building block on what needs to happen before end times can occur. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that here in just a second. So the key here is, then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. You know, Ezekiel prophesies, he's carried into captivity in 598 in the second group of captives. It's not until 5 or 6 years later that he begins to prophesy. So let's call this 593 or so, before Christ, he says, I will bring you out of exile, then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. So a lot of people believe this is the most important sign of all. Without a reconstructed Israel, most other end times prophecy can't happen. That's especially true in Revelation. So here's kind of the timeline. 70 AD, Rome destroys Jerusalem. Israel ceases to exist as a nation at that point. In actuality, Israel ceased to exist as a nation in 586 when Jerusalem fell, because they were under a number of oppressors from that point on. So as a nation, there is no Israel from the fall of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. On May 14th, 1948, the nation of Israel reappeared in fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy. But there are countless Old Testament prophecies that say the same thing. In 1948, Israel was partitioned into four major areas: Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, and Jerusalem. I put a map on the table in front of you to give you what that meant. First of all, this wasn't a new thing. This partition was not a new thing. This goes back to something, and Aaron, I know Aaron is going to do a couple of sessions Tuesday. Is he doing two, Jeff? On this issue, I think. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. 1917, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Prime Minister Balfour, issued something called the Balfour Declaration. In the Balfour Declaration, 1917, in the Balfour Declaration, he says that Israel should have a land once again. Well, part of the reason for that was one of the aggressors, or one on the axis of World War I, fighting against the United States and Great Britain, was the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, who at the time had control over Palestine. From 1920 or so, after the Balfour Declaration, they began working on this process. Ultimately, what's called the British Mandate, when Britain takes control of kind of the governance of Israel, the British Mandate said that Great Britain would be in charge of Israel and what was then called the Transjordan as a result of what happened in World War I. So Great Britain is in charge for, call it 20, 25 years or something, until 1948 when Israel became a nation again. If you look at your map, you get kind of an idea. I didn't bother to do slides for this because actually this isn't part of our process, but if you look at your map, you'll see that the 1947 UN declaration indicated where Israel was and I'm going to use the term Palestinian. Here's the reality. Most of these people are not Palestinians. Palestinians goes back to when the Philistines, and if you look at the Gaza Strip today, if you take a map of the Gaza Strip and overlaid it over what was Philistia during the time of David, you'd find almost the exact same territory. So it was an area occupied by the Philistines. Philistines are not Arabs. Philistines are likely from the northern Mediterranean that were called seafarers. That's what the term meant, was Pelesheth, seafarers. So Palestinians and Arabs are two different. Arabs are actually Semitic. They're from the same branch that Jews are. So it's called a Palestinian territory, and at the time it was primarily occupied by Palestinians and Arabs, with the Jews as kind of a minor group. In the 1947 UN partition plan, you can see what was ultimately going to be the division. And it was divided into, and that's why they kept them separate, by the way, divided into Gaza, primarily Palestinian, the West Bank, primarily Arab, and then Israel proper, which is in white, and then Jerusalem itself was intended to be governed by kind of an amalgam, because that was considered a holy site to all. So all of this happened in 1947, and as I said, we feel the reverberations today. That's exactly what's going on in the war today between Gaza and Israel. Gaza, and you'll see this, you've probably seen it already on the news, you'll see this kind of tagline that says, "Free Palestine from the river to the sea." That's actually in the Hamas, there's a Hamas almost like constitution with 46 articles in it. And in that constitution, it says that Palestine will be Palestinian once again from the river to the sea, from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. Now, if you talk to anybody who is a Palestinian sympathizer, they're going to say, well, they're just talking about a political solution. That's not what they're talking about. The solution is the extermination of Israel. That's why you see what's going on today. And that's why you saw what's been going on in conflicts from get-go. So the first sign is that Israel once again was reconstituted as a self-governing nation in 1948. Second sign, we'll go back now to the Olivet Discourse. The second sign was what is a great falling away. By the way, I could have taken probably 30 signs out of just the Olivet Discourse that points to kind of end times. I took what I thought were the most, probably the most important. So the second sign is going to be a great falling away. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus warns his disciples concerning the final days. And here's what he says. At that time, in other words, when all this occurs, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, in some versions have lawlessness, the love of man of most will grow cold. And that's in Matthew 24:10 through 12. You also find it in 1 Timothy 4:1 through 3. 1 Timothy talks about the same thing in terms of, Paul talks to him about those falling away in the future. Well, it doesn't take you much to figure out what's going on in today's church. But let me just hit some high points for you. There's a New York Times article that was published 2021, March of 2021, reported on a Gallup poll. Now, most of you are familiar with Gallup polling. Gallup has been around since, well, actually, I can tell you when it was. 1938, I believe, was the first time Gallup began polling. Probably one of the most reputable polling firms in the entire world. So they did a poll kind of regarding the state of the church today. And here's what they found out. For the first time in 80 years, in other words, since they began taking polling, Gallup found less than half of U.S. adults belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque. And they point out that America's membership in houses of worship continued to decline last year, dropping below 50% for the first time. This is in March 2021. Prior to that, when Gallup first started polling, 73% said they were a part of some religious organization. Back then, it probably would have been mostly Christian churches. And that continued for 6 decades. That 70% mark continued for 6 decades. But beginning in the 21st century, there became a steady decline. Membership dropped from 50% in 2018 to 47% in 2021. So the point is that what Jesus said, there would be a great falling away. This isn't just falling away of people who no longer go to church. This is a falling away of people who never went to church in the beginning. In fact, Gallup, in that poll, said the largest growing group of people who responded to the poll were something they called nuns.
Called what?
Nuns.
Nuns.
Not N-U-N-S. N-O-N-E-S. In other words, we don't have any church. And 29% of the ones they polled said that they had no religion. So the second sign then is the falling away. You probably evidenced in your churches. I know we have. I had, just before I did this session 2 years ago, I think it was, I had lunch with DJ and Mark, and I said, well, what kind of shape are your... This was after COVID, by the way. COVID had a devastating impact on church attendance. So I said, tell me where you guys are. Both of them almost immediately said we're off 30%. Here, about the same. Across the board, you'd probably find most churches before and after COVID off by at least 30%. That doesn't mean people aren't attending. What they may have learned is, you know what, I can go to church sitting in my bathrobe in the front room and watching somebody. To tell you the truth, I still do that because there's some good sermonizing. But Paul is going to tell you, do not forsake the assembly. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get a little further into it as well. So the second sign would have been then the great falling away. The third sign, and one that Len referred to yesterday, is in all of that discourse. Jesus says there will be an increase in wars, famines, and earthquakes. This is the most relevant to us today, is his prophecy of an increase of wars and rumors of wars. And here's what he says, Matthew 24, 6 through 8. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. I'm going to say that again. See to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So the question about, is this the end? Maybe, may not be, but it's certainly there are signs pointing in the direction. There have been signs, as I said, since the crucifixion. Now, let's deal with this. Are there more wars issue, and are there more? Interestingly enough, the USGS says there really aren't more magnitude earthquakes, large magnitude earthquakes. We average about 16 a year that are large magnitude, from 6 to 8 on the Richter scale. But they say there are at least now 20,000 earthquakes per year in the world. Part of that's due to better measuring techniques. Part of it's due to more stations. So they don't really say there's a lot more earthquakes. They say we continue to have about the same number of magnitude 6 through 8 earthquakes. But still, 20,000 a year is not an insignificant part. In fact, we've had a few here in just the past year or so. Not here, but in Colorado. So.
Len was saying there have been, 3, 4 earthquakes in Afghanistan that you don't even hear on the
In the
news.
last couple of weeks.
Yeah,
That's probably true.
they're about six or so.
The only ones that I know that we hear about are those that get measured by USGS or some other, and they get measured and not reported. In Afghanistan, they probably don't even tell you about it. And I did see something about the most recent Afghan earthquake. So of the 20,000, how many more don't get reported? Let's leave earthquakes for a minute, though, and talk about this wars and famines issue. And there is you probably will want to subscribe to this. There is a magazine that's called, it's an electronic magazine, I don't think they do a print version anymore, called About Times. And About Times, by the way, in all of your, in what I gave you here, you should find footnotes at the bottom that, do you want me to send this? I can send this electronically because then you can just click on them. You'll find the resources that I use to put most of this together. Well, About Times is all news about end times. It talks about everything in end times. I don't think you want to subscribe to it because by the time you finish reading it, you won't know whether to kill yourself or go bowling. But here's what they said. Or golfing, that's true. About Times goes through, and I did the same thing, went through Wikipedia. There's some other sources that does it. And Wikipedia listed all the wars that have occurred since the 15th century by date. They do the same thing for famines. So About Times went through and they totaled all those. It's kind of a painstaking process because if you go click on Wikipedia, you're just going to find the date, the war, and where it was. And there's list after list after list. So you end up having to count them. Some of them get double counted. But the big point is here. If you look at the ones I gave you, in the 15th century, there were 29 recorded wars, major wars or conflicts. By the time we get to the 20th century, 10 times the amount, 278 wars have been noted. And I gave you the numbers from the 15th, 16th through the 20th century. In the first decade alone of this century, has already witnessed 55 wars. So if we extrapolate that means we're on a course for 550 wars over the next 100-year period. So is there an increase in wars? There certainly appears to be. What about then famines? Well, the same source, Wikipedia, lists a number of famines over the last 500 years. They've also increased in frequency. Beginning in the 15th century, there were only 6 famines recorded. By the 18th century, 28 famines. By the 20th century, 44 famines. Now, I will tell you, these are a little difficult to try to count because if you go into the Wikipedia, some of them are counting a famine that occurred in one geographic area that also affected another geographic area that's counted as a different famine. So it's a little difficult, but it's the point is still a magnitude of from 6 famines in the 15th century to 44 in the 20th century. In the first decade of this century, the 21st, there's already witnessed at least 12 famines, putting humanity on a course of 120 famines over the next 100 years. So,
What's their definition of a famine?
Jeff, I can't tell you how they defined it. It may, and I think what it has to do with deaths due to malnutrition or deaths due to starvation. But I can't really tell you the exact definition of it. And I don't know if they even do in Wikipedia. I guess, and I would take all of this with a grain of salt. If you think about it, it kind of makes sense from the standpoint of how many more people there are in the world, right? And how many are in countries without resources. And it probably has a whole lot to do with those areas that are in droughts, that kind of thing. Jeff, if you have more interest, I would go click on the famines in Wikipedia and see what they showed. I don't remember them talking a whole lot about how they got to the numbers. They just do a pretty much big list of the numbers. I guess for our purposes, the point is that what Jesus says, and remember, he says, this is the beginnings of. Well, Matthew wrote this in 55, 56 AD. So from that, Jesus' words from that time on, he was talking to every generation from that point on, and probably every generation. In fact, I can tell you that my mother-in-law was convinced that she would not die, that she would see the rapture. She died in 2008. I want to say 2008. I better check that. So every generation from the crucifixion on has believed these were last times. Well, I guess the real question is, all right, so we've kind of looked at some of the evidence. Well, where do we go from here? So the Bible gives what I think are at least 3 answers. And the first is this: to be an encourager. We often read 1 Thessalonians 4, 15 through 17 that talks about the rapture and what's going to happen at the rapture. But we skip verse 18, and verse 18 says this: therefore, in other words, Paul is saying because of everything related to the rapture, therefore encourage one another with these words. And the words are that we are going to be raptured. Paul later on goes on in chapter 5, and he ends the discourse on the rapture, what most people believe to be the rapture. And I will again tell you that there are a number of thoughts on when the rapture occurs, or if there is a rapture. If there is, Paul says this in chapter 5: for God did not appoint us to suffer wrath, but to receive salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. He died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. That's in 1 Thessalonians 5, 9 through 11. So the first thing we can do is encourage each other. The second thing we can do is be prepared. In the Olivet Discourse, the Olivet Discourse ends in chapter 25. And in chapter 25, there are 5 parables. And the reason I'm making an emphasis on that, I'll tell you in just a second. There are 5 parables about being ready. And they follow the verses about you do not know the hour when the Son of Man will return. The reason that I made the point that there are 5 parables is there are only between 30 and 35 parables of Jesus in the entire New Testament. 5 of them, 5 parables about end times, are located in chapter 24, chapter 25 of the Olivet Discourse. So why would there be that much emphasis on it? Well, because Jesus is saying, be prepared. Now, the question is, how do you be prepared? Well, I've done it. We've talked about this before. You know what your job description is? What's your job description as a Christian? Pardon?
To share Jesus with others.
To share Jesus with others. I'll buy that. But I'm going to give you 3 requirements of a Christian. First of all is to glorify. Glorify is a relationship between you and the Lord. That's a vertical relationship. In other words, glorify Jesus, glorify the Lord. The second is, and I think these are in your notes as well, the second is to edify. Now, Lynn, you're a builder. What's an edification or an edifice?
Face, Bill.
It's a building. Yeah. So a building or a structure, that's where we get our term edifice, edification. Edification means to build up. So the first relationship is one with God. The second relationship is a relationship with other members of the church. The edifice of the church is to edify, to build them up, to build members of the church. And the third one, Lynn, you hit on, is to testify. That may be the biggest. So what is it we should do to be prepared? Just those three things: glorify, edify, testify. I think Jordan made a good point yesterday. For those of you who weren't there, Jordan said, why wouldn't you want, how come we are so reticent to talk about heaven? How come we are so reticent to talk about end of life and heaven? Seems to me that if it's as good as everybody says it is, which means you don't have to play golf, that we should be over eager to share that with other people. So in the second piece of what we should do in the face of coming end times, being prepared, is to share that message with as many people as you want, or as many people as you can. And finally, the third one is this: be an evangelist. And that goes a lot with what you said, Lynn. Peter talks about end times in his second epistle. He's likely months or weeks away from being crucified. Yet Peter is saying, here's what you need to do. Peter knows. Peter and Paul both knew that they were, by this time, Peter's probably in prison in Rome as well, by the time he writes 2 Peter. Yet he's writing back to his churches to encourage them. And here's what he says: do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Now listen to the but that comes in the next verse. But, and I've said before that but's one of the biggest words in the Bible, because it's going to juxtapose two things. But the day of the Lord will come like a thief. The heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. By connecting end times with warning not to let anyone perish, Peter makes the point that time is short. So act. So is this the end? Maybe. Maybe not. In fact, according to Luke, what Luke talks about, when he talks about end times, he says it will come when you least expect it. And he talks about how it was in the days of Noah, where people were partying and having a great time. So Luke says, when you least expect it. If that's true, if you're expecting it now because of what's going on in Israel, you're wrong, because it's going to come when you least expect it. Follow me? But there are two things that are certain in all of this. And the first one is this: we're closer to Jesus' second coming today than we were yesterday. We'll be closer tomorrow than we are today. So is end times coming? Yes, it is. Here's the second thing. Jesus promised this: if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. So you can take that to the bank. In terms of timing, I'm the last in the world to say time, it is the time. I'm the first in the world to say be prepared for it at all times. And that's Jesus' whole message. Always be prepared for it. So did that help with kind of how the Bible, or at least all of that discourse, views kind of what's going on in Israel today?
Lynn was expecting you to give us a date.
What date would you like, Lynn? I'll give it to you. Did you have anything else? Any other questions?
March 13th.
Oh, that would be good. Yeah.
I think people need perspective on it too, because it's not like, if you've gone through the stats, it's not like we've never had a war before. I mean, look at the Mongols. They took over all of Europe. That is a bigger scope than anything we've seen in our lifetimes. I mean, even the Holocaust in Germany and all that, World War II, was a pretty small, ton of people died, but it was a pretty small area. They didn't take over all of Europe. The Mongols rolled through the whole place, just randomly killed and pillaged them. I mean, it was Hamas, but not for the sake of Jews. But right, so we got to keep perspective, I think, and we think, oh, there it is. I mean, there's been wars all the time. People just don't get along.
Well,
Cain killed Abel, man. It started with the first one.
that's true.
So we should be surprised.
That's true. Have been wars, and there will according to Jesus, there will always be wars. So I don't think we should be surprised. I think all of us are always a little more tense in anything happening in the Middle East. Or, for that matter, anything happening that has the potential of global implications. You know, the last 2 times we did a session like this in Masterman, the last time was during the pandemic. Because you recall at the time, everybody said, oh, it's end times. Look, it's pestilence. Do you remember that? Well, we're here today. The next time it happened is when Russia invaded the Ukraine. And everybody went to Ezekiel's prophecy about Gog and Magog. And they said, well, this is Russia invading the Ukraine. And that's Gog and Magog. And here we are at end times. I suspect, well, I can't say this because I just said I can't tell you when it's going to happen. It might happen before we walk out of here. Maybe already happened, which means things are tough for those of us who are left here. But I suspect that whatever's going to happen in the Middle East, that there will be a period of time when we'll see something else happen after that, if this isn't the end times. The point to all of this is, the Olivet Discourse and everything else that Jesus talks about in end times says, these are the signs, and most importantly, don't be a Twitter about it. I mean, don't be like catatonic about it. Do what it is I sent you here to do, because the time is short. So did that help? Lynn?
All right, so pre-trib or post-trib with the rapture,
Okay.
which is it?
Well, we've talked about that quite a bit. When we did Revelation, I think it's pre-trib.
Okay, so follow me for a second.
Okay.
So the rapture would happen before all these other events. Okay, and as I understand this, in the rapture, Jesus doesn't come to earth. He's in the clouds, there's a trumpet and whatever.
Correct.
Okay, then you get to the millennium. At that point, Jesus does come back to earth, correct?
Before the millennium.
I'm sorry, yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yep. Yeah. Most who believe in a pre-trib rapture will say the church will be raptured based on 1 Thessalonians. The church will be raptured. It'll be the first event that ushers in the 7 years of tribulation. So the rapture will occur, and then, although we're not given any kind of timeline in the Bible, sometime after that, and most people believe relatively soon after that, will begin the period of tribulation. Interestingly enough, any kind of war doesn't occur until the end of tribulation. So if this were the end war, we should first of all, we shouldn't be here. Secondly, we should have gone through 6.5 years of tribulation. Then the last thing that will occur in chapter 19 of Revelation, when Jesus does come back, and that's called the parousia, when he does come back, he will come back as the warrior king. That's the one time he will be the warrior king. And that's when he's going to go, and everybody's gone.
So when you have time, look up 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 54, because it fits in with this too.
Yep. 1 Corinthians 15, by the way, is it is the seminal teaching on what happens when you die in 1 Corinthians 15. There's some great chapters in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 13 is the love chapter. 1 Corinthians 15 is what happens. That's where you get you were born perishable, you were raised perishable, you will be born perishable, you will be raised imperishable. There's some great stuff in it. So I'll go look at it. All right.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes.
So there is, and I don't know if this is Matthew or where, but when this happens, that generation will not pass away or something. So what is that referring to when what happens? Is it when Israel became a state? No.
No. When and a lot of people say that when he says this generation will not pass away before all these signs, Anybody who believes that this was related to the first century is saying that points to what occurred in the first century, has nothing to do with what's going to go on in end times. When he's talking about this generation, he's saying when you see all these things happening, this generation, meaning the generation that is on the earth at that point, will not pass away until these all occur. Does that answer your question? Okay. And Ernie agrees, therefore.
It's got to be gospel, right?
All right. We still have about 15 minutes. Does anybody have any objection if we go back and spend a little time on
This generation.
yeah, on this generation? Yeah, that's right. Because we left off in our study on culture on gender and sexuality. And where we left off was sexual behavior today, and we're going to deal with homosexuality and something called sexual dysphoria. First of all, is everybody okay spending a little more time with that? If you aren't, I guess you can just leave. Let's see. I didn't record what page you're on your notes, but I'm guessing page 5 or 6, maybe somewhere there. 6?
Oh, in the notes, I was looking at
Back in your notes. First of all, let's talk about homosexuality. I want to make 3 points. The first is this. In 2015, the Supreme Court ruled laws prohibiting same-sex marriage unconstitutional. Now, that had some impacts. First of all, it normalized gay marriage. Secondly, it affected Christianity, and I'll tell you about how that occurred. And thirdly, it brought up the churches, what I think is the churches, not just me, but Joe Dallas believes was the church's abrogation of their responsibility, which I agree with. So let's look at how some of these things happen. So first of all, normalized gay marriage. Second of all, it affected Christianity. Let me tell you what Joe Dallas says, and Christians in a cancel culture. He says this. First of all, the Supreme Court ruling said, but people who still have religious beliefs and think this will affect the family structure, they should be able to continue to do what they want. He says, well, that sounded fine and just fair. The rights of religious organizations and individuals to seek and teach our principles about sex and family were still protected in the Supreme Court ruling. We could even advocate with sincere conviction that same-sex marriage could not be condoned. So everything was good, right? Well, here's the but. Then, the California State Assembly entertained a bill that would make it illegal for a Christian counselor to charge for his services if he helped a repentant homosexual abstain. So to get around the Supreme Court ruling, it said, okay, go ahead and counsel, you just can't charge for your services. Second thing that happened, a presidential aspirant said all churches that do not affirm homosexuality should lose their tax-exempt status. The third thing was then a president-elect met with a group advising him to strip Christian schools and universities of their accreditation if they don't change their policies on LGBTQ. And then finally, the State of California Assembly passed a resolution advising pastors and Christian counselors to avoid telling homosexuals they can change. So what the Supreme Court ruling did was you can continue to do your practices, but then you start getting state legislatures, and most of these came from California, saying, oh yeah, you can do that, but you can't charge for this, you can't teach that, you can't do this, you can't do that. It has become difficult, Dallas goes on and says, it has become difficult to square current trends with past Supreme Court reassurances about First Amendment rights. And that is the substance of what we face when we address homosexuality today. On this issue, above all others mentioned in this book, we're compelled not only to explain our beliefs, nor just to defend our beliefs, but also to defend our right to hold and practice those beliefs, as a growing segment of society comes to view them our views, Christian views, as harmful. So the first thing is how it affected Christianity. But he goes on to talk about the church's abrogation of their responsibility. And here's what he says. Modern condemnation of the biblical view on sexuality often comes in the form of, 1, belief in the inborn nature of homosexuality, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. 2, the number of churches becoming gay affirming. In other words, churches becoming complicit in this process. And 3, the number of churches making this a secondary issue. These issues are the ones you're likely to confront when discussing homosexuality. And when he says to make them a secondary issue, what he's talking about is, the churches that say, oh, you believe in homosexuality, I don't, but let's not worry about that. We got bigger fish to fry. You cannot eliminate a number of pieces of the Bible and continue to say, I profess to be a Christian, in my estimation. So the first thing I want to talk about in homosexuality was the Supreme Court ruling. The second one is the gay gene that he refers to, that we've all heard about. Since 1991, we've been told that there's a biological reason for being gay. In other words, I was born with it, I can't keep from it, therefore I have to do it, and you shouldn't try to change it. Well, nobody was ever able to point to where this gene was or how it came about. Interestingly enough, in 2019, the public broadcasting system, PBS, probably one of the most conservative groups in the entire world. Boy, if you didn't see the tongue-in-cheek there. He reported on a study of, I want you to listen to the numbers here, 500,000 people. And they took all the studies they could find of everywhere. Now, PBS reported on it, and I don't recall exactly who did the study, but here's what it says. This is a quote from PBS. This closes the door on the debate about the existence of a so-called gay gene. This is PBS. In other words, no one has done anything to be able to point to this supposed biological reason that people are gay. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't really done much to change the debate because Joe Dallas discusses this as well. And listen to what he says. With time, as LGBTQ advances have accelerated, there's been less debate because there's less need. Studies indicate the majority of Americans don't find homosexuality immoral. Since the public is largely convinced, the argument intended to convince became less crucial. After all, people are not likely to care what causes something they're already okay with. Now the push to prove homosexuality is inborn has been replaced with the assumption that it's inborn, since there's no proof, repeated for decades in the spin cycle. The public presumes so many talking heads can't be wrong, so it must be true. Not because it's been proven true, but because it's repeated. In other words, what he's saying is, hasn't really done much. The fact that there is no gay gene hasn't done much to change what people perceive. You know, Joseph Goebbels was probably the best one to quote, if you want to quote somebody, I guess, from Hitler's regime. He is the best one to quote that if you repeat something often enough and with enough force behind it, people will come to believe it, whether it's true or not. So that's the second item. The third item I wanted to deal with was the complicity of the church. And let me tell you what he says about that. Well-known evangelical converts to a gay-affirming view of the Bible include a number of people, Tony Campolo, Jen Harmaker, Rachel Held Evans, a former Mars Hill pastor and author, Rob Bell. He gives a number of them. And all have embraced pro-gay interpretation of the Bible that revises the meaning of verses assumed to condemn homosexuality. By the way, there's at least 12 of them that you'll find. Starting all the way back you can go all the way back to Genesis and Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, here's what he says. Whole denominations have been making a similar shift, including the Presbyterian Church USA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the Episcopalian Church, along with individual congregations formerly associated with the Southern Baptist Convention, the Assemblies of God, and the Vineyard Fellowship. All of which leads gay friends and loved ones to ask, if so many Bible-believing Christians are seeing the light, why can't you? In other words, you're wrong. The convergence of other evangelical leaders and groups can incite similar questions, not quite converting to a pro-gay position. They bring the pro-gay and anti-gay positions together in a let's all get along convergence by saying, hey, you're a Christian, believing gay is okay. I'm a Christian who disagrees, but who cares? We're all one in Christ. So in all of this, I think we have to take the responsibility. The church has to take the responsibility for being complicit in all of it. So now, that's dealing with homosexuality. I want to spend just a minute. We're going to finish this up with dysphoria, word that I'd never even heard until recently. We're going to deal with dysphoria, and then we'll stop there and we'll come back next week in 2 weeks and discuss what does the Bible say. And finally, we get to use the slides. I bet you've been wondering, aren't we going to get to use slides today?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. The dysphoria issue was an outgrowth of the gay rights movement. First of all, what is dysphoria? Here's the definition of it. Gender dysphoria, which, by the way, is probably only 10 years old in our lexicon, or gender identity disorder, which has been there longer, is the distress a person experiences as a result of the sex and gender they were assigned at birth. In this case, the assigned sex and the gender do not match the person's gender identity, and the person is transgender. Well, you wouldn't have had this definition 20 years ago, would you? Because everybody said sex and gender is the same thing. Do you remember our discussion a little while back of when that first began to be separated, back in 1939, or I don't recall the exact timing? So you wouldn't have had this definition then because they were considered the same thing. So let's talk a little bit about it. And again, I'm going to go back to Joe Dallas. He's probably one of the better ones to look at in terms of these kinds of things because he's a Christian counselor. And I think he may have been, I can't swear to this, may have been president of the American Association of Christian Counselors. So he is a counselor that deals with this, and here's what he says. It has become an outgrowth of the gay rights movement. This is an unexpected conversation. Most of us never thought we'd discuss the transgender issue. First, because we knew so little about it. Second, because we doubted we'd ever know a transgender person. And third, because the facts about our sexes seemed so self-evident, we didn't think they'd ever be challenged. Well, I certainly thought that until a few years ago. It's common knowledge today that transgender movement is closely aligned with the gay rights movement. Hence the popular label LGBTQ, which we talked about before. The transgender movement has drawn generously from the playbook of the gay rights movement. From the 70s onward, gay acceptance has advanced through television, has been advanced through films, television characters, sympathetic journalists, the American Psychiatric Association, anti-discrimination laws, and the educational system and celebrities coming out. The national debate shifted accordingly. The questions eventually evolving from is homosexuality normal to are objections to homosexuality normal. Those who hold such objections are now find themselves subject to intense pressure and scorn. The movement's success is now emulated by its transsexual cousin, which has also advanced through films. So his point is that this became a natural outgrowth of what the homosexual issue was. Now, and Moeller talks about redefining humanity himself in one of the other books. And he considering the effects on the following. First of all, it affects the sports world. And I want to tell you what Moeller says about that. This will just take a few more minutes and then we'll be done. Here's what Moeller says. Interestingly enough, you know where one of the big controversies are happening right now? It has to do with should men be competing in men's sports, right? You know who one of the biggest advocates against that is? Martina Navratilova, one of the earliest lesbians ever to say she's a lesbian. She says there's absolutely no business. Men have no business in competing in sports. Let me give you what Moeller says about this. But now it is absolutely clear that the most radical and revolutionary letter in the LGBT acronym is the T for transgender. More than any other compartment of the LGBTQ revolution, the transgender movement represents an attempt to redefine humanity itself, not just human sexuality. Indeed, many gay and lesbian activists who ought to celebrate transgenderism now find themselves on the wrong side of history as the sexual revolution continues to spiral out of control. And he goes on to talk about Martina Navratilova. So the first thing it affects is the sports world. The second thing it affects is commerce. And I'll give you just 3 examples. And they've come up again. Bud Light's lost over $18 billion with a B dollars in market value. Target lost $9 billion in their Pride controversy. There's been a host of others that this issue has affected. What about government? You know, we have the first trans cabinet member ever in the Biden administration today. Rachel, whose real name is Richard Levine, is Assistant Secretary of Health. Does that make any sense?
Only to Biden.
Yeah. So it affects the sports world, it affects commerce, it affects government. You don't have to go too far to the governor of the state of Colorado to find that out. And here's the last one. It affects the English language. You're probably saying, well, how is that true? Well, let me give you an example. Last week I rode what was called the Fall Blaze, which is a Fort Lewis bike ride. To register for the Fall Blaze, you have to go through and give them the age and your sex and all that, which is fairly common because they kind of categorize you. So in the sex category, it has male, female, trans. There's about 8 different lists that you can pick from. And then they ask the question, what pronoun do you prefer?
Well, hold it, which gender did you check?
All of them.
Yes, yes.
So, and the problem with that is this. I was reading an article recently about a transgender person whose preferred pronouns were they and them. The article was talking about how the transgender person was having a discussion with a group or was being questioned by a group, and they kept talking about they being the transgender person, and when they went to they to talk about the group, they used the word they as well. So which they is they? Do you follow me?
Yeah.
What are we going to do with pronouns? What's the English language going to do with pronouns if this continues? So,
It's here to stay.
well, it's here to stay until Jesus comes.
Well, of course.
That could be today. We already talked about that. So why don't we stop there and come back next week, and we'll find out what the Bible has to say.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. I keep saying next week. 2 weeks. So what is it?
2 weeks.
2 weeks, right? I don't know.
Here's what, the transgender thing is fascinating to me because you've seen a greater effect in like sports and bathrooms, right? Versus if you're gay, there's never a discussion of bathroom use, whatever, use your bathroom. But about 1.6 million people in the U.S. identify as transgender out of 332 million, which is 0.004%. Like literally we're spending so much time talking about a group of people, specifically transgender, that is, there's more people probably with one arm out there. I mean, it's unbelievable that you get such a loud voice. Now, of course, they have the backing of the other initials too, But like, we're literally changing our bathrooms. Target is having a promotion and supporting this and putting it out there, right? Based on such a small percent. Like we said before, if you watch TV and you came down here from space, you'd think everybody was gay. Because every commercial, every TV show has a gay
Something or other,
theme
yeah.
in it. I'm like going, and I love the pushback on Bud Light and Target where people go, hey, enough, like stop. At some point, I mean, it's kind of like politics too. If it goes too far left, it gets back right. If it goes too far right, it gets brought back to the middle.
That's been my whole issue, my whole point about all of this. And we talked a couple weeks ago about how even if we use the greater number of 7% of 320 million people, why is it? In no other place would you find such a minuscule proportion of people driving the entire conversation and driving the entire culture than here. And I'm convinced it has to do with what we talked about earlier. Who's driving it? The media, corporations to some degree, although the corporations are starting to feel the effects of it. Liberal politicians. It's being driven by people through social media who are making what I think is, if you had said, and I think you're right, Keith, if you had said, I'm going to start a movement for people who are left-handed. Do you know how many left-handed people are in the world? A lot more than 1.6%, but have you ever seen, are you left-handed? Well, there you are. Just look at that.
Yeah, you're really right.
Have you ever seen the disproportionate power that has been wielded by this kind of group? Let's stop there. And we'll come back next week and do what does the Bible say about all this? I keep saying next week.
Well,
Thank you
I'm gonna
guys.
show up and be really mad, Tom.
I know. Well, let's do this. I'm going to leave the book with you, Keith, and if people show up, you just do it. Is that good?
I'll be in Florida. I'll do a remote.
Oh, okay.
You know
I'll be on the
who's,
golf course.
you know who's really driving it all?
Pardon me?
You know who really is behind driving it all?
Who?
The enemy.
Oh, well, that's a good point, Ernie. I'll buy that.
Hey, Tom, when you get your new body in heaven, you'll be a scratch golfer. You'll enjoy it.